Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's well. Hello, my name is Nancy Lindborg. I'm the president of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today. And for those of you who are not familiar with USIP, just a quick note that we were founded more than 30 years ago by Congress as a federally funded, independent national institute. And we were funded and founded with the proposition that peace is possible, that it's very practical, and that it is absolutely essential for our national and our international security. And so U.S. Institute of Peace has a mission of working for a world without violent conflict. And we do this by working with partners around the world, and particularly in conflict-affected areas, to equip people, institutions, and governments with the very practical skills and the tools and the information that allows them to manage conflict so that it doesn't become violent and to resolve it when it does. And we operate on the premise that there will always be conflict, and the challenge is how do we make conflict transformative as opposed to violent? So we are working around the world with partners to make peace possible. And without question, one of the defining stories of the last several decades has been the increased presence and influence of China around the world. And we are seeing that China's government, that its companies, that its citizens are more and more active and engaged around the world. And this presents both opportunities and it presents challenges for how to enable that to be part of how we manage and resolve conflict. And we here at U.S. Institute of Peace are particularly interested in the way that China's role in the world affects global peace and conflict dynamics. I think everybody here would agree that China and the United States don't always have aligned interests and approaches, but we do share many interests, many complementary peace-building goals, and it is definitely in our shared interests to ensure that conflicts don't erupt into the kind of violence that disrupts business, often results in terrible loss of life, and rolls back very precious peace-building and development objectives that both of our countries invest heavily in ensuring. And so USIP is very interested in looking at those areas where our objectives converge and where there are areas for coordination and cooperation. And when views don't converge, when we have differing views, how do we prevent those differences from exacerbating instability or complicating our peace-building efforts? Right now, one of China's most high-profile global engagement efforts is the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, I'm told. Do we call it BRI or just BRI?
Belt and Road Initiative.
No, we don't use initials. Okay, all right. Acronym police alert. But this is a presidential level initiative, and it aims at investing trillions of dollars across Eurasia over the next several decades. This effort, as I think many of you are quite aware, is looking at connecting China with Central Asia and with Europe over land, and also reviving links by sea. So our panel today, thank you panelists, is very much focused on the biggest project within the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. We can call it CPEC, right?
Yes.
Okay, acronym. China and Pakistan have a very close diplomatic relationship, and China has a pledged investment of nearly $50 billion, which is substantial and has the potential to really dramatically reshape Pakistan. So this is an important time to have this conversation about CPAC. The first large shipment of goods has already reached Gwadar Port in southwestern Pakistan just 2 weeks ago. Afghanistan and Iran are also interested in joining CPEC. So it's an important time to have this conversation, and we're delighted to have this very expert panel of discussants here today to talk about CPAC, its implications for peace and conflict in Pakistan, and really the broader effect on security throughout the region. So to moderate the discussion today, I am just delighted to introduce Jennifer Statz, who's our director of the USIP China program. Jennifer has been with us just under a year. And before that, she was with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where she focused on policy issues related to Asia's security and particularly cybersecurity. She's worked as Director of Cybersecurity and National Cyber Partnerships, where she coordinated closely with the White House and throughout the interagency and the private sector, and previously led teams in the Strategy Office of DoD, looking at the whole rebalance to the Asia Pacific. So she is, we are a wonderfully energetic new director for us, and I'm just delighted to hand this over to Jennifer to take us through this conversation. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Nancy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for what I'm sure is going to be an excellent discussion on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. I think we all know this is an issue that's been getting a lot of attention here in Washington and also around the world, and we're going to focus today on sort of where things stand so far, but then also really focusing on the implications for peace and security, both within Pakistan, but also within the broader South Asia region. CPEC is obviously an ambitious and very high-profile initiative. It has support from the very top in both the Pakistani and the Chinese governments, and I would say that both countries really have a lot riding on its success. So there's a lot to discuss today. I've talked with most of the panelists earlier, and I know they have a lot to say, so I'm going to be very brief and really want to turn it over to them. Again, this is a great time to be talking about CPEC. Things are just really starting, I think, to materialize on the ground, and we'll hear more about that from the speakers today. And there really are a lot of reasons to be very optimistic about CPEC and the benefits that it might bring to Pakistan. But at the same time, I think it's not a panacea, and there are definitely concerns about how the implementation will go forward and the effect that that might have, again, on Pakistan and on the region. So it's really, I think, a fascinating story, one that's just getting started, and we are very lucky to have 4 true experts with us here today to help us make sense of where we are and where things may be going forward. So our first speaker will be Hussein Nadeem, who has been here at USIP for the last 3 months as a senior Pakistan expert, and he has really been a terrific addition to the Asia Center and the rest of the Institute as a whole. Before coming to USIP, he was a former special assistant to Pakistan's Federal Minister of Planning, Development, and Reforms, where he helped oversee the implementation of CPEC projects in Pakistan. And so he will discuss today the progress of specific energy and energy and connectivity projects with CPEC, as well as the impact that CPEC may be having on Pakistan's economy and internal stability. Our second speaker will be Arif Rafiq, who is the president of Vizier Consulting, LLC, and also a fellow at the Center for Global Policy and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. He has been doing extensive research on CPEC over the last year and has been on the ground in Pakistan talking to government officials, business leaders, civil society organizations about the various parts of that project. And so he will discuss today some of the institutional capacity challenges facing the Pakistan government with respect to the CPEC initiative. We're also very pleased to have Zhao Hai here with us from Beijing. He is a research fellow in the National Strategy Institute at Tsinghua University, and he will discuss the importance of CPEC to China's broader Belt and Road initiatives and the impact that CPEC may have on China's relationships with Pakistan and with India. And finally, last but not least, we're very happy to have Sarah Watson here. She is an associate fellow with the Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And she will help round out our discussion by highlighting some of the regional considerations for CPEC, specifically providing some of the Indian perspectives, but then also discussing some of India's concerns related to CPEC. So we've got a lot of ground to cover and not a lot of time, so I'm going to let our panelists speak first for about 10 minutes each or so, and then we'll try to leave as much time as we can at the end for questions and answers so that everyone else has a chance to participate as well. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Hussein.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for showing up. Just to state it at the very onset, my views expressed over here do not represent the views of any organization or government, and I would like to wear a scholarly hat specifically for this forum to discuss CPEC, which has somewhat also become a controversial issue in Pakistan, so you have to be very cautious when you're talking specifics on the subject. But it's very reassuring to be here today, partly because this is the second event on CPEC, specifically in this week. And it is, I'll start by giving you an observation. I was in DC last time in 2012 at the Wilson Center, and the conversation back then when I was meeting people in different departments and institutions was a lot about terrorism specific on Pakistan. It was Salala had happened, OBL had happened, and the conversation was much more on that. Fast forward 2016, and the conversation is not just only about terrorism on Pakistan, but it's also a lot about CPEC. What are the details? There is a lot of curiosity in the U.S. specific to this project, which is somewhat an achievement, I think, and a sort of reflection of how the narrative around Pakistan is slowly shifting. The real question would be whether Pakistan is able to monopolize in this or not. I'm going to talk about the China-Pakistan relations first, just to give a brief overview on what the relationship has been and what is it right now. Also going to talk about the context of the CPEC and how we developed it, I think, because that's essentially very important to understand. Otherwise, to understand the full value of $50 billion, it will be very difficult. And the third thing, I'm going to talk about the current status of some of the projects that are there, specific to the early harvest projects. CPEC, Pakistan-China relations, I think it could be divided into two phases. One is pre-CPAC and the other is post-CPAC. In the pre-CPAC, I think the relations there was a lot more talk on the relations. There was a lot more talk, deeper than the oceans, higher than the mountains, sweeter than the honey. Whether there was substance in it or not, I don't think the substance was as much there. Pre-CPEC, the relations were very much India-centric. The conversation was a lot more about the security. And on the pre-CPEC level, there was also very little cultural ties. Post-CPEC, I think the conversation has changed. Now, while there is a lot more talk, but it is also substantiated by a lot more economic gains, some projects, and something to actually show in terms of substance. While India-centric remains to be one of the focus, the relationship is a lot more about the business-centric, economic-centric as well. The third thing, there is a genuine interest now in people-to-people engagement, in cultural ties, where I feel that the government is now in Pakistan a lot more interested to have Chinese center open, allowing people to learn the Chinese language, have exchange programs in the universities, and we've really seen that China is now becoming one of the top priority places for the Pakistani students to go and study for their master's degrees or for graduate school. And learning Chinese is now becoming one of the most, I think, fashionable things, if I have to say, I think, because that is how the economy in the world is going. So the conversation, the pre-CPEC and the post-CPEC has now completely shifted, and I feel that there is some substance and meat now when we talk about Pakistan-China relations, for instance. The context of the CPEC, I think, it needs to be understood, specifically in Washington, D.C. You need to realize this thing that CPEC, the $50 billion, came at a point in Pakistan where Pakistan was struggling. It had an economic meltdown. We had energy crisis. No FDI. No country wanted to do business. We were lagging in sports. We couldn't have cricketing matches in Pakistan. No team would come to Pakistan to play. And the country was becoming more and more isolated, not just internally but externally as well. There was polarization within the society. What CPAC has essentially been able to do is not just have an influx of the money, but it has kind of changed the mindset internally in Pakistan. It has given a morale boost. It has given a sort of confidence that we're still part of the international society, which Pakistan's foreign policy has been mostly about. I think one of the biggest worries of the Pakistan foreign and security establishment has been the fact that we might get isolated at one point. And isolation is the biggest fear that the Pakistan security establishment feels. CPEC has been reassuring because it has not only allowed Pakistan to inject a lot of money on the economic, to turn the tide on the economic front, but on three fronts, I think, has had an impact. One, in the real economic terms, on how much you're going to gain out of this. The projects, the infrastructure, the energy, which I'm just going to talk in detail. You have a whole new port and a whole new city being built by the name of Gwadar. So that's one of the real economic impacts that you're going to see, which has already been felt. When I go back to Pakistan and I was working there, I think the mood has shifted. The economy has shifted where people actually feel now that there is business activity. There is contracting. The cement industry is growing. Every sort of industry linked to construction or energy sector is now booming. So that's the real economic impact that we have felt. The second one is based on the political and the stability front. While there have been issues on the CPEC front, specifically when it comes to the Balochistan, the western route and the eastern route, but it is understandable with such an influx of money coming in, there will be rivalries, there will be political battles, and it will be politicized. So that has happened, but the reassuring part is that the institutions in Pakistan have been able to come together on this specific project. There are ups and downs, there are issues, but large and holistically, I think the picture is safe for Pakistan at the moment. The third part, which is most interesting, is the perception element. I think CPEC alone itself has not only changed the morale of Pakistan, but globally in terms of perception, you have, while I was still there, the British government was actively engaging with us to be a part of the CPEC. The French government had shown interest recently. You have Iranian government showing interest. So for Pakistan, this is something that's like a dream come true, that you have a dearth of interest in Pakistan in terms of economics. Everybody wanted to talk specific to security when it came to Pakistan, but now there is a genuine interest on the business side as well, which Pakistan had been lacking for some time. So that is the perception level. You have ratings after ratings, Moody's, Standards & Poor's, Bloomberg, that has been putting Pakistan on a stability front or on a positive front. And then you also have KSE Index, the Karachi Stock Exchange, which has been going in a hyperdrive and is rated one of the Asia's biggest miracle in itself in the stock exchange. So with these things, I think there has been a lot of positivity that is coming out, and I repeat this thing a lot on the positivity front, because essentially, if the people in Pakistan feel that this $50 billion can change its fate, which I personally feel that the Americans or the World Bank or the IMF had lost credibility in, the fact that $5 billion, the Kerry-Lugar bill, or other materials, other forms of aid had failed to deliver over the period of years, I think there is genuine hope with this investment that something can be changed. It is a momentum where the government of Pakistan and the people actually feel is going to be a fate changer, a game changer that we like to call. There are challenges, there will be challenges when we talk about an injection of so much money. It will not be without challenges. But we can discuss the challenges as we speak, but I would think for government of Pakistan, the biggest challenge would be how do you maximize the dividends out of this. Essentially, such a project will change you to a certain point, but the real challenge would be how much change are you talking about? Are you going to go to a potential of 100, 80, or just stay around 30, which is easily deliverable? So for Pakistan, the real question is whether they can really milk this out or not. And I think that will be the key on that front. In terms of the projects, I will also discuss that in detail, but we have projects on the energy front, $33 billion of portfolio. On the infrastructure, we have almost $11 billion. And I just talked this morning with Referred Minister Ehsan Iqbal to see the status of the projects, and it's very assuring that our early harvest projects are almost 60 to 70% completion, with 2017 and in 2018 completion date. We have solar power in Bahawalpur, Qaid-e-Azam Solar Park, which is functional, producing 400 megawatts already. We have Port Qasim 1320 megawatt. We have Saiwal 1320 megawatt coal-fired power projects, which are near completion already. So it's not just the talk that is there, but the speed has also been met in the past 2 years. You have energy projects that have either been near completion or they're somewhere in the inauguration process and elsewhere. You have recently, as Nancy mentioned, the shipment of the first shipment arrived in the Gwadar port, and that was done through the western route. So there has been completion of road networks on the western front, specifically from Quetta down to Gwadar and Rotadero as well. So the projects are there, the physical impact can be seen on ground, and we'll discuss that later on how this will change the things on ground. But I would like to end my initial remarks on here and take it forward from here into discussing the details of the project, what may be some of the challenges that will be coming. And I think Arif will be discussing specifically on that. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'll do is I will complement Hussein's presentation on what exactly CPEC is, what are the nature of the projects, where is the funding going toward, and what are the objectives behind these various CPEC projects. And then I'll give some brief, make some brief comments on the likely impact of CPEC, and then I'll address some of the barriers to implementation that don't necessarily represent an existential threat to CPEC, but may slow the implementation or to some extent minimize the potential promise of this, this mega project. So what is CPEC? And when I look at some of the early reporting on CPEC, there was one news article that said that it was an $18 billion tunnel connecting China and Pakistan, because the term corridor was interpreted very literally. Even right now, many people perceive that there is this sort of linear route connecting China to Gwadar, the Arabian seaport in southern Pakistan, and that most projects are located along this corridor, and there's going to be a synergy between some sort of new road network that is being built and various energy and economic projects that are being built along that line. That's actually not the case. So CPEC, to a large extent, doesn't really change the geography or the logistics network inside Pakistan. It largely consists of upgrades to Pakistan's existing road network. And so highways that are, for example, 2-lane highways or 4-lane highways are being upgraded into 6-lane motorways that are closed off and can enable speeds of, let's say, upwards of 70 miles per hour, as opposed to, let's say, the current speed limits of around 50 miles per hour. So one of the major investments is in a motorway that connects Pakistan's two largest cities, Karachi and Lahore. So as part of CPEC, one portion of this motorway project is being developed. And so there are other funders that are contributing to the development of this motorway. So, for example, the Islamic Development Bank is developing one portion. Another portion is being funded by a consortium of Pakistani banks. So CPEC is not something that, it's not developing necessarily a new logic inside Pakistan. It's utilizing an existing road network and upgrading it and improving the efficiency of connectivity between, inside Pakistan, between its largest cities, and also between China and Pakistan and potentially beyond the region. Aside from certain projects connecting Gwadar, which are actually funded by other multilateral organizations or foreign lenders or development organizations such as USAID or the ADB, there's not really new paths that are being developed. And so CPEC largely fits into Pakistan's development agenda. Around 76% of CPEC funds are going towards electricity generation projects. Most of the remaining amount is going into infrastructure development. Of that spending on electricity generation, 75% of the funds are going toward or allocated for coal generation, coal-fueled power plants. And so the end result through CPEC and a host of other projects is that Pakistan will have a more diverse fuel mix in terms of its producing energy, generating energy. And so it's going to be moving away from costly diesel and diesel oil and furnace oil that it currently is its primary source of fuel generation. You'll have an influx of around, the Pakistan Planning Commission estimates around 17,000 megawatts of energy will be generated through the first phase of CPEC. Through my own analysis, maybe around 8,000 megawatts are more likely in the first phase, but it'll help deal with the gap between supply and demand in terms of Pakistan's electricity market, and also diversify it, lower the costs, and reduce its vulnerability in terms of fluctuations in the global energy market. So, those kind of elements, those goals don't really offer much directly to China. But what is China getting out of it? These energy projects are all commercial projects, so it's not, assistance, it's investment. And so Chinese companies have very advantageous margins that are being locked in through upfront tariffs and other incentives. Through CPAC, the Chinese companies will be getting some loans that are not necessarily considered concessional, but are pretty close enough. So interest rates are around 5%. So many Chinese companies, due to excess supply in China, are moving outside the country, and they're utilizing their own excess labor and expertise, exporting hardware, and they will. They'll be making quite a bit of money off of CPEC. So this is, a project that will address Pakistan's fundamental gaps in terms of its energy supply, which has increased the cost of business inside the country, deterred foreign investment, has really hampered its textile industry, which is a major source of exports, and make it more viable. And then you have these road connectivity projects, which will increase the efficiency of its logistics network and make it perhaps more competitive with some other states in the region that have seized quite a bit of market share from Pakistan in terms of the textile industry. So Bangladesh, and then a bit further away, Vietnam. So, what is the likely impact? I think when we look at CPAC, CPAC is not the only game in town. So CPAC perhaps will add 8,000 megawatts to Pakistan's electricity grid. There's currently a shortfall of around 5,000 megawatts, and demand is estimated to increase at about 5% a year. But there are, by 2020, there could be projects outside of CPAC that actually generate the same amount of electricity than CPAC projects. And many of these projects involve Chinese partners. So there's a synergy between CPAC projects and non-CPAC projects. They serve the same objectives of making Pakistan a more livable space, a viable space for business, hopefully will result in a revitalization of the textile industry, and perhaps make additional value-added industries more competitive inside Pakistan, so including the home goods, home appliances, small manufacturing products, and then heavy industries as well. When it comes to the logistics networks, CPAC actually might benefit the port of Karachi more than the port of Gwadar. Karachi is the Karachi area is home to Pakistan's two largest ports, and the Karachi to Lahore motorway will actually service Karachi's two largest ports. So there's no direct motorway that is being connected to the city of Gwadar. But in terms of Gwadar, I think there's a huge variation in terms of Pakistan in terms of trying to identify what kind of niche it can find in terms of Pakistan's exports and even its own domestic market. And I think the more sensible proposals sensible visions have kind of centered on petrochemicals and the bulk brake industry and these smaller niche industries that would, service a port that is, far removed, that a port that is far removed from major economic centers can kind of offer. Now, in terms of barriers to implementation, I would say that the greatest barrier at this point in time, in terms of the sustainability of CPEC, is Pakistan's inability to develop a sustainable consensus about the CPEC plan. So that's not to say that there is wide dispute in Pakistan about the idea of CPEC itself, about the idea of partnering with China to address Pakistan's electricity shortages and enhance connectivity between Pakistan and China and other regional states. The conflict is over the details. So many political parties and activists from Pakistan's smaller provinces feel that CPEC could be a train that will pass them by. So what we have is quite a unique situation in Pakistan where even ethnic nationalist parties that may have had separatist tendencies in the past are very keen on partnering with China and receiving and benefiting from the influx of Chinese capital and having Chinese investments or assistance increase jobs, provide electricity in their remote regions, and improve the livelihoods. There's an electoral benefit as well. So if people from your area, if the CPEC route passes through your area, contractors or subcontractors will get that business, and if they associate that the fact that it was located there because of you, you might get some funding in terms of the upcoming elections. So it fits into the objectives of a broad segment of stakeholders inside Pakistan, including the military, as well as the mainstream political parties and regional ethnic nationalist political parties. So there's a broad-based consensus in favor of CPEC. But the smaller political parties feel that the federal government, which also governs the largest province, Punjab, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, has essentially diverted much of the initial resources towards its own province. So not just in terms of the road networks, but also in terms of the electricity generation projects. And there's a fear that this will have a generational impact because CPAC is a 15-year program, and so in this initial phase, some of the more developed regions of Pakistan will be disproportionately benefit from this funding, and then that disparity will never be bridged over the course of time, and it could in fact magnify. And so as a result, there have been a series of crises might be a bit of a excessive term to use, but there's been some acrimony, periods of high acrimony in Pakistan on CPEC, and that has resulted in the Prime Minister of Pakistan and then sometimes smaller political parties. They've organized what are called all parties conferences, in which a broad segment of political stakeholders get together and discuss an issue, and in this respect it would be CPEC. And there's been a debate over the various routes because the belief amongst Pakistan's smaller political parties and political parties that come from the three smaller provinces is that the original CPEC route was a bit focused on the western end of Pakistan and moved from Balochistan in through parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa into Gilgit-Baltistan. But in 2014, there were reports of a new CPEC route, and it looked as if it largely aligns with the allocations that exist today, meaning the Karachi-Lahore motorway, which are now described as the eastern route. And so essentially a compromise came about of the development of three routes, an eastern, central, and western route. And so there has been still challenges in terms of ensuring that allocations are made for these various routes, and that has served as point of contention between Pakistan's smaller political parties, some of the opposition political parties, and the ruling Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz. And so there's a challenge in terms of developing a sustainable consensus because CPAC is a 15-year project. It consists of three phases, three 5-year phases, and ostensibly that would mean that there would be three different governments during that time period. So assuming a new government comes to power in after 2018, if there are democratic elections and a smooth transition of power, then working on precedent, what we could have is that a new government could cancel previous projects, change tariff rates, and so on and so forth, and there would be a decline in investor confidence in Pakistan, and the future phases of CPEC could be put into jeopardy. There are also challenges between the civilian government and the military, or the Army specifically, in terms of securing CPEC. So the Army would like to play a lead coordinating role, but the civilian government has resisted in terms of conceding that space to the Army, and so it's actually withheld, according to press reports, funding for part of the CPEC security plan, and that has kind of set back the plans to assemble and mobilize a 16,000 personnel force to secure CPEC. There are some other challenges in terms of institutional challenges inside Pakistan, and we can get into that in the Q&A, but a considerable amount of the CPAC funding consists of loans that are concessional, but they're high in number. And so Pakistan will need to generate a high level of economic growth in order to be able to pay back these loans, despite the existence of some concessional rates and deferred payment. It will still have to end up paying back these loans for infrastructure. And even in terms of the energy projects, which are largely commercial, the Pakistani government will have to serve as a kind of a guarantor so that the payments are made in a streamlined fashion so that Chinese companies get their money back. And so even on the investment side, the Pakistani government has assumed some liability. So if CPAC drives up growth in Pakistan, the federal government will largely have enough funds to be able to pay back these loans. But if growth continues to remain tepid, we could see some problems in the future. I think that's enough. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much. So, two views there on what's going on within Pakistan, and now we'll hear from the Chinese perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me. So first, I have to apologize. I just arrived last night after 14 hours of flight. So I'm in this big jet lag, and my head is still spinning. So if I say something extraordinary or outrageous, please believe me, those are all true. So on the way here, I took a taxi, and I tried to get a grip of Chinese people's understanding of the CPAC. So I asked the taxi driver, do you know about CPAC? And he said, yes, I know. It's a huge project in Pakistan. And so I said, do you like it or not? He said, well, that's a lot of money. I don't know if it's good or bad. So I said, but do you think investing in Pakistan will be worth it? He said, yeah, Pakistanis are our good friends, so we should invest there. So I guess that's a good answer. So after I arrived here, I took another taxi from the airport to downtown. The taxi driver is, very interestingly, from Tajikistan. Actually, it turns out he's a translator for the U.S. Army while in Afghanistan. That's why he got the green card, probably, moving here. So I asked him about Afghanistan, too. He said, well, there's still a conflict because Pakistanis are supporting Taliban in Afghanistan. So I asked him, too, do you know about CPAC? He said, yes, I know. So I said, do you think it's going to be good for the future of both Pakistan and Afghanistan? He said, probably, yes. So I guess if both taxi drivers knows this projects, must be good, right? Must be at least has a very interesting impact on a global stage. So first of all, I want to talk about the reasoning or the motivation behind not only CPAC but also, One Belt and One Road project. Later on, it's called Belt and Road Initiative. They changed that name a couple of times. In the beginning, they called that a plan, but later on, they changed that to initiative because first they believe they can do it as in domestic projects. They can plan everything, but then they realize they have to involve other parties, particularly the real local owner of this project, Pakistanis. So they say, oh, okay, now we're providing actually initiative, not planning everything, but coordinating with our partners. So basically, if we go back into history, the real reason of the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the biggest reasons is economic. In 2008, after the economic crisis, the central government invested 4 trillion RMB to save the economy, and then the local government also invested about 10 trillion RMB. So altogether, it's about $2 trillion. In just 2 years, 2 to 3 years. So after that, there's a huge hangover. There's a huge after effect of those investments. Those investments mostly goes into government-funded projects. That means goes into infrastructure and other related, particularly power projects. And that inflated the industry completely. So it has this overcapacity all over the place, and they cannot produce enough profit margin within China. So they have to find a way outside of China, find another market. And they, right after that, they came up with this idea of One Belt and One Road to accommodate, to develop market overseas, particularly in the areas that there's no or not enough infrastructure and power planning. So that's one reason. And the second reason specifically for CPAC and also for the BCIM, Bangladesh, China, India, and Myanmar corridor, another economic corridor, another big Belt and Road Initiative projects, are what I call locally driven. Because there are a lot of provincial initiatives that involved. The BCIM is primarily conceived in Yunnan province, where they wanted to find their own lane to access to the Indian Ocean. And the CPAC is primarily promoted by Xinjiang province, where they wanted to develop Xinjiang, the western part of China, and get that up to speed. So one of the reasons in that is because after 30 years of development, there's a huge gap between the eastern part of China and the western part of China. And they wanted to sort of mitigate, alleviate, or match up east and western part of China. And one way to do it is to have more access to the international market for the western provinces of China. And that two corridors is what they conceived for the future of those provinces. So if you look at the map, the One Belt and One Road is east-west in direction. And then if you look at the two corridors, it's pretty much south and north and south corridors. These two actually linked the land line and the sea line together. That's a grand scheme of these projects. And what they hope is to not only achieve economic, but also strategic outcomes out of these projects. So another important factor came in late, I think November 2011, when the Obama administration declared rebalancing towards Asia-Pacific region, which pretty much pushed China look westward. And after that, you can see, and later on, a year later, there's this South China Sea dispute between China and Philippines. So China is facing a wall or a very strong resistance in the West Pacific, and President Xi Jinping started to look west, and they found opportunities, particularly in Pakistan and also the Central Asia and also Africa. That's where the plan started to shape. So. When Xi Jinping himself got involved and put CPAC as his flagship project on top of everything on the Belt and Road Initiative, that became China's political will to push forward. So all the bureaucracy and everything, state banks, state-owned enterprises, are all diving into those projects and investing billions of dollars in those projects, regardless of the future returns. Actually. So as you said, there's a very low interest rate put on those projects, and sometimes even lower than 5% if you go through the Bank of Import and Export. Right now, I think 2 weeks ago when China declared the road between Kash and Gwadar has been passing through those routes, Chinese domestic media celebrated the success of that and says that marks the initial success of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think they will definitely continue on this road to develop the CPAC. One thing is Chinese government is very well aware of the risks and dangers and low economic returns of these projects. But I think they realized putting this project forward can be an advertisement for the Chinese leadership, global leadership, and also China's willingness to invest in other countries and help them develop. And the other thing is that Chinese companies, from their perspective, particularly state-owned enterprises, they're willing to pay this as a tuition to catch up the learning curve, and then to match up with other global companies, multinational companies that are working globally. And they're lacking this kind of experience, and now they can use this opportunity to learn and to catch up. So this too is kind of important reasons for China to continue to invest huge amount of money in those areas. And lastly, for the relations between China, Pakistan, and India, it's very interesting. I talked to some Indian think tank people just a couple of weeks back, and a lot of Indians are against this CPAC project. And also the Indian government, if you look at their proposal, their concepts of development around the India-Asia-Pacific region, they're proposing lines that are 90 degrees against Chinese lines. For example, when China has this Pan-Asia Railroad that is north-south in direction, India will propose a east-west channel cooperating with Japan across the Southeast Asia. And also, when China proposed the CPAC, India would also propose another line that goes north across Afghanistan into Central Asia. So this and also, I think the people I talked to suggested that the CPAC corridor should have branches, not only going north-south, but also east-west, cutting through the borders between India and Pakistan. And India is saying, okay, on the one hand, they're very sort of vigilant and cautious about CPAC, but at the same time, they wanted to also participate. But they're proposing, actually, we connect, cross each other and connect, and then make the whole region benefit from this project. So I think there's one mutual kind of distrust between China and India, but at the same time, there's a possibility, a potential to cooperate with each other on these projects. About Pakistan, China now is kind of worried about CPAC. A lot of Chinese are worried about the CPAC because of when they get more and more into Pakistani domestic politics, they realize how complicated that is. And they realize how this big project throw in, the impact would be huge, and they cannot control the outcome. One thing is that they worry about is the conflict between the army and the civil government. And also the other thing is about different regions where you have different ethnic conflict and religious extremism over there. So they worry about that, and they try to balance those forces and also keep distance from the domestic disputes and try to maintain their kind of position over these disputes. One thing, if you look at Xinjiang, that China worries about, of course, is the separatist, also religious extremism in the Xinjiang area and Xinjiang province. If you look at southern Xinjiang, the demographic configuration nowadays is really very worrisome for the central government, because now in Kash, the beginning of the CPAC, the city of Kash, there's already, I think, over 96.5% of the population are just pure Uyghur population. The Han Chinese reduced after the terrorist attack a couple of years back, reduced from, I think, 6% to now 2.5%. So they're starting to lose control of southern Xinjiang because the population shrink, particularly the Han Chinese population shrink. So they hope that CPEC and other Belt and Road Initiative projects can revitalize the region, have it economically developed so that they can combat and reduce the possible extremism and separatist movement in the area, and also attract more Chinese workers and Chinese companies to go into those areas and invest into those in those areas against the worry of terrorism. So I guess I'll stop here, and we can discuss later about more issues. Thank you.
All right, moving on to Sarah for an Indian perspective and regional perspective.
Great. Thank you. That's an excellent segue into the Indian perspective. I have a couple of slides for illustrative purposes, but I can't see the screen, so I'm nominating my colleague Sid, who's in the audience. This is a surprise. Hi, Sid. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can actually see the first slide, if I press this button? I switched it off. Oh, it was supposed to be off. Okay, so you've all been looking at it. It's not a surprise anymore. I'm going to go through what I see as the three principal Indian policy visions that stem from CPEC and from OBOR as a whole. And each policy vision has a corresponding policy prescription. The first, as I see it, is a Chinese-Pakistan condominium, which assumes a military aspect, and the corresponding policy prescription is to be opposed to CPEC. The second is a more optimistic vision that OBOR and CPEC could benefit, as I said, the region as a whole, and that India could take part in it. And the policy prescription that goes with that is that they should support CPEC. And the final policy vision is Chabahar and the associated infrastructural projects in Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia as an alternative to CPEC. Obviously, the policy prescription there is build Chabahar and the associated infrastructure projects. So take them one by one. On the first point, I think Indian concern about the possibilities for India of a closer India-Pakistan relationship is justified. Just in the past couple days, we've seen reports in the Pakistani media, at least, of China's intention to have PLA Navy ships patrolling around Gwadar. We've seen reports that equally had to be taken with a grain of salt that Russia, which is one of India's oldest strategic and military partners, is interested in getting involved in CPEC in a major way. There have for years been newspaper reports that the Chinese military has a pretty significant presence in what Pakistan calls Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Jammu and Kashmir, what India calls Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. The greater China's investment in Pakistan, the more likely it is that China will be willing to break with its historical pattern of supporting Pakistan diplomatically and rhetorically in international fora, but very firmly drawing a line between verbal support and actual military support in the case of a conflict with India. Obviously, a two-sided war is India's nightmare scenario, and I don't think you can really blame them for projecting outward in an attempt to forestall that happening. The second response is that India will actually find a way to make OBOR benefit them. And I don't know if anyone went to see Manoj Joshi's presentation on Sino-Indian relations at Carnegie earlier in this week. That was the note he was striking. And in a sense, because it's such an optimistic, outward-looking note, it's great to hear. It's, in fact, a little surprising to hear. But when you do hear these statements, they're rarely accompanied by a plan to make it reality. So that's where my first slide comes in. Is it still up there? I stole this from the Reconnecting Asia website, which is a project of CSIS. It's really fantastic. I would recommend everyone check it out. This is their interpretation of China's vision for OBOR, and including CPEC. And what I think you can notice here is that, with the exception of the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor, none of these projects involve India in any way. In fact, if it had been designed to avoid India, they were doing a pretty good job. So BCIM, which does connect the city, or is envisioned to connect the city of Kolkata in India with Kunming in China, is very far from being a reality. And in particular, there's a 300-kilometer, very mountainous stretch between the states of Assam and Manipur in northeastern India that India has to complete. So unfortunately, I'm not holding my breath for that to be done anytime soon. Even if it were done, that would be a corridor largely for the import of Chinese-made goods from Southeast China into the consuming states of Northeast China. Even Kolkata is a very large city, but it is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the industrial hub of India. And in fact, it's on the other side of the country from India's industrial hubs. So even if India wanted to use a BCIM to connect to OBOR as a whole, they would have to ship everything to Kunming and then connect to the larger OBOR products and go back west. It wouldn't really be a cost-effective strategy. So the bottom line is that OBOR, if India wants to take advantage of OBOR and the possibilities that it represents, it has to act, it has to do something. It has to put out tentacles, even if they're intersecting tentacles. So India builds a north-south and China's building an east-west corridor. They connect with each other, they can build on each other. We aren't seeing a huge amount of plans by India to do that, and certainly not a lot of action. China isn't building OBOR out of the goodness of its heart. It's building OBOR to get Chinese goods to Western markets. There's no reason why it should, also out of the goodness of its heart, create a path for India to bring its goods to Western or Southeast Asian markets. So the next slide is India's vision. Did it change? Thank you. I think the main takeaway from this slide is how much smaller scale it is and how much vaguer it is. And in fact, the good folks at Reconnecting Asia, from whence I also stole this slide, were forced to kind of put in some vague arcs and squiggles because they weren't even really sure what path, despite their efforts, some of these projects were going to take. Also, I think it's important to note that there isn't a lot that India is going to do under this plan. A lot of it depends on other countries. So, for instance, the North-South International Transport Corridor, which actually has been around as an idea since at least 2001. You don't hear a lot about that outside India. And if you want to make your future, it's nice to not have to rely on Azerbaijan to be doing its part, or Turkmenistan to be doing its part. In a way, relying on countries is suitable for India because it has limited resources, much more limited resources than China, but it makes its future much more contingent. The final policy vision is of the Chabahar port and the associated projects as a north-south parallel that will allow India to connect to Afghanistan, to Central Asia, and ultimately to Russia and the Baltic states. So the third slide, actually, sorry, I'm going to go back one. So Chabahar is slightly misplaced on this map. It's a couple hundred miles to the east, but the idea is that goods will be offloaded from India, will get on a ship in Pune or on the west coast, travel to Chabahar, be offloaded, be taken by road or rail to the Afghanistan-Iran border at Zaranj, where they will then take the Zaranj-Delaram highway, which India actually paid for and built, connect to the Afghan ring road. So this map, Sid's looking at it strangely, but it's there. Okay, sorry, Sid. This is the Long War Journal's map of Taliban influence in Afghanistan. It was updated as recently as October. Black is Taliban-controlled districts, and red is Taliban-contested districts. The two red dots, the one on the lower left is Zaranj, and the one on the upper right and to the up of that is Delaram. And what you can see is that Delaram is right on the edge of a Taliban-controlled district, and there is yet another Taliban-controlled district blocking off Indian access to Herat via the ring road. And if you want to go south to Kandahar, it's really not that much better. So the vision of Chabahar and these associated projects opening up Afghanistan for Indian goods is really dependent on a much more stable and secure future for Afghanistan than I can see looking forward at the moment. You also don't see India doing a great deal to try and ensure that future either, although it's difficult. And it's doing more than it has been doing in the past, but that's a long, long road to home. So I think in conclusion, any of these three policy visions could, with equal likelihood, kind of ab ovo, stem from India's and China's plans in South Asia. However, only one of them will happen if India does nothing, and that's the first one, which is CPEC and OBOR becoming a nexus for a closer China-Pakistan cooperation and really beginning to shut off India's access to global markets or make it more difficult for India to access global markets. The other two depend on India acting. So therefore, simply if you have three options, two of which depend on an action, and one of which will happen simply from inertia, the one that happens from inertia is probably the most likely. So unless India really engages in a very concentrated program of infrastructure building and outreach over the next few years, I think their worst imagination is more likely to come true than their more positive ones.
All right, thank you very much to all four of our panelists. That was a lot. I think you did an excellent job covering the waterfront in a short period of time. I've got a very long list of questions, which I will not go through it all to give everyone else a chance to ask questions. But I did want to start, since you've got the Afghanistan map up on that front. So we talked about the Chinese vision basically bypassing India, and I note, if you actually put that map back up, it also bypasses Afghanistan. And so I'm curious if the panelists have any thoughts on what impact all this might have on Afghanistan. I don't know, for all the reasons Sarah mentioned, that we'll see significant investments there, but I'm wondering if you think there might be any spillover benefits, either on the economic front, or if the CPAC investments will change the security situation in Pakistan enough that it has spillover security effects in Afghanistan. So just be curious if anyone has thoughts on that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think when you look at Pakistan, I think Afghanistan is Pakistan's third largest trade partner, second or third largest trade partner. And in the past year, trade between the two countries has declined by around, I think, 20 to 30%. That's part of a strategy by Afghan President Ashraf Ghani to reduce his country's economic dependence on Pakistan and perhaps use that as a lever to change Pakistan's behavior towards Afghanistan in terms of various security issues. And so I think there's a desire in Pakistan to integrate Afghanistan and use Afghanistan as a gateway to Central Asian republics and link them all to both the Gwadar port and the Karachi port. But as long as there's this insurgency going on and also tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the possibility of further integrating Afghanistan into Pakistan-based logistics networks is pretty dim. And at the same time, Afghanistan has actually increased its use of the Chabahar port in terms of trade with India and also exports to, I think, to the Gulf region. Afghanistan, there's a very optimistic vision of CPEC where it serves as a gateway for connecting Pakistan to India, to Afghanistan, to the Central Asian republics, even Iran. But that is, I think, the economic promise of CPEC in terms of regional integration is really held hostage by the various strategic challenges that the region faces. Even with India, for example, the western city of Amritsar in Punjab, the closest port for that city is actually Karachi. Historically, pre-partition, they used to use Karachi as the port of choice. So there's a possibility for connectivity in terms of the east-west route, India-Pakistan as well. But unfortunately, there's the security challenges really inhibit further economic integration.
I kind of agree with Arif on this, but I think as grand as the ideas and the strategy and the maps look on paper, I think realistically speaking, the government of Pakistan is not thinking beyond Balochistan, and that too from a lot of difficulties. For CPAC to Pakistan, I think the idea that somehow we're going to get Afghanistan integrated into this, or India, I have not seen any conversation on that. It is to some level, policy level, there is a conversation that this will probably integrate Pakistan into a greater regional debate, but in terms of the projects, in terms of the substance, I think that is missing. Our concern specifically, the government of Pakistan, is to have some level of economic growth, be able to provide that job opportunity, to develop the infrastructure, and I don't think they're thinking anything that is beyond Pakistan's immediate concerns. Balochistan would be one of the concerns that have been integrated into the CPEC, but beyond that, I think it's too early to talk about CPEC as producing or being able to change the world or change the region.
So I guess I was going to ask you on that question, from the Chinese perspective, do you think there will be significant Belt and Road investments in Afghanistan, or what role do you think that will play?
Just one follow-up, and then I'll answer your question. First of all, to Sarah, I think not only China wants to export from China to Europe and Africa through this Belt and Road, but also one of the biggest reasons for China to build that is for energy security. So oil from out of Middle East and shorter range to access to China, and then also safer access to the Middle East oil. And China is now, I think, surpassing U.S. In terms of percentage imported from overseas, and I think over 60% of China's oil now from the Russia, Middle East, and Africa. So it's very important for China to secure that route. And also, to answer the question for Afghanistan, I think China right now is very cautious about investing more in Afghanistan because the Chinese government still want to wait and see what would happen if the United States and NATO forces withdraw from Afghanistan, how long the current government can sustain itself. And the struggle between the government and also the Taliban forces are still going on. And once the ISIS collapse in the Middle East, probably they will move eastward, and there will be more trouble in the mountain areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Just, I think, a month ago or something like that, there's a train from China going through China to Kazakhstan and then Uzbekistan to Afghanistan. So the train is already, the railway is already accessible to Afghanistan. But once the train is there, there's no internal railway to distribute the goods. And there's only a road, but no railway. So apparently Afghanistan needs a lot of infrastructure and a lot of reconstruction after the war. But right now, the environment, I agree with you, that the environment does not allow that kind of project to, like in Pakistan, to open up.
All right, so I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience. If you've got a question, if you could raise your hand, and then when acknowledged, you could stand up, state your name, and let us know where you're from, and then ask your question. Great. We will start with you.
Thanks. Moeed Yusuf from USIP. Let me just ask maybe either Hussein or Arif, and then our other panelists as well. So CPEC, we talk about China, Pakistan. Sarah, you talk about the essentially the India-Pakistan-China competition, if you will, in that sense. I want to ask about complementarities here. And the question I have is, CPEC is a north-south setup, various energy projects, road structures. And Arif and I were talking before offline that it actually naturally is set up in a way to complement a number of other things that are happening in Pakistan. There may be energy infrastructure, or there may be other projects in terms of locations, etc. Some of that is funded by the Pakistan government, but a lot of that is funded by, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the US, and others. Is there a vision here that largely probably comes from the Pakistani state, but could be a collective effort, which turns this entire narrative of China-Pakistan versus the rest around to say, Pakistan's stability is in everybody's interest. This is a major project. Here is how the others are already helping. And thus, rather than all credit to China, all credit to everybody, thank you, come, this is open for business. You're still doing everything, but you're doing it in a competitive way. Why not simply turn this narrative around to make it cooperative? Because ostensibly everybody wants Pakistan's stability. And then on India, which I think is rightly worried if this is where this is going, I think if you want to change this entire paradigm, the silver bullet here is India trading through Pakistan. And if Pakistan can allow that, then you have that overland access, you have the port access, and actually it benefits Pakistan tremendously because the Shahbar and everything die a natural death because it's not economical anymore. And then you've got real cooperation, north, south, east, west. And to me, it's a narrative change. And if everybody can change that narrative, it probably forces India and Pakistan to look and see whether they can make that happen as well. Thanks.
I think the first part that you talked about, Pakistan has been actively talking to the United States, at least that I know of, to be a part of the CPEC agenda. They have had the discussions with the British as well, and the interest is to build that momentum, like you mentioned, to have that sort of momentum to take the CPEC forward and have the other countries peg to it. But there are also potential problems with it, I think, and that might be from the Chinese side. For China, I think CPEC is a poster project, and they would like as much as possible to have their big tag on that. And for Pakistan, it actually also works. The more you dilute CPEC with, for instance, other countries, and the Chinese name itself, which sells in the markets, it sells around the world in trade and everything. I think Pakistan would like to make sure that it is pegged around that, but it doesn't want to completely cut out everyone, which is why we see that Pakistan has been reaching out. And frankly speaking, the other countries have been reaching out Pakistan on that. But they would rather have this one big country, which is the name right now, to be at the center and have the other countries spiral around it. But they would not let, or I don't think the Chinese would want to have it get diluted as well.
I just think from the Indian perspective, I mean, obviously there would have to be enormous paradigm shifts on both sides. It takes two people to make to fight, and it also takes two people to trade, right? So you'd have to, in order for India to want to abandon its plans for Chabahar, make a long-term investment in, an assumption that they are going to be going through Pakistan, they would have to believe that that border post isn't going to be closed at the slightest provocation. And I think that in terms of this being a win-win situation for everyone in the region, one of the things I'm really looking at is this a project that's going to strengthen the civilian democratic institutions in Pakistan, or is it going to strengthen the military institutions? Right now, I think we're seeing is a certain amount of military rent-seeking in which they are actually building up their budgets by the justification being, that we need to protect CPAC. So if this could be something that could become, that the civilian democratic institutions could really own and could say, look, we provided this to you, that might help it strengthen Pakistan's civil society, and I think that could really make it a beneficial project for the region.
Just two fingers on that. I'd like to respond on that because that's, I think, very important, and I don't want to miss that. There's a certain perception that somehow the military is very much actively involved. I've been part of the project since its inception, and it is fair to say that the project was developed, visioned, and has been completely implemented, is being completely implemented by the civilian side. The military's only concern was that they felt that the pace was so quick and it was being done in such a quick way with the Chinese that military could not get the information. And as soon as the government of Pakistan was able to have the military on board, have their senior representation sit in the steering meetings, I think that has also been solved. But the project by itself is specifically being done, led by the civilian side. So I think the civilians institutions, I'm not sure too much sure about the institutions itself, because that's another debate altogether, how it's going to impact the bureaucracy, the deliveries. But at least the civilian political establishment will be taking the eventual credit, the ownership of this project. On the security side, I think it is actually the other way around. It's not the military that was trying to make money out of this. It was the government that actually asked the military that we need to deliver in Balochistan. And some of the institutions that can actually deliver in Balochistan was actually the military. So the government of Pakistan ended up contracting a lot of work to FWO, Federal Works Organization, which is run by the military, specifically for this cause, because it was not able to develop projects in Balochistan. So the military took over of that. So I think there isn't any civil-military tension. And I would like to clarify that perception as well, that there is somehow a perception on that.
Can I have three fingers?
Very
Or do you want to?
quickly,
Okay, very
yeah.
quickly. I mean, I think the two reports to that are, one, the first shipment that went out of Gwadar had a military escort the entire way from Gujarat and a naval escort the minute it went to sea. And the second question is, if it really isn't militarized, the project isn't being militarized, why did they raise was it 15, 20,000 man security force for this, as opposed to, what India has, a central industrial security force, which is a civilian-controlled police organization?
I think the first part, why they had the military convoy is partly because it was an inaugural project. So you take the military along just to make sure it is provide security. But I don't think every shipment or every single thing will be led by the military convoys. I think it was just to start off with.
All right, obviously lots to talk about. I saw lots of hands, so what I'd like to do is take a collection of about 3 questions and then let our panelists respond so we could try to get more questions on the table. So go ahead in the back. She's got a microphone for you.
Sorry, not loud enough. Kamran Bukhari, Geopolitical Futures. So this is to anybody, but directed at Sarah specifically. Did I get the name right?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. So CPAC is already in motion. It has its challenges, largely related to the security within Pakistan situation and the political instability and of course Afghanistan. But Shah Bahar, development of that port involves the Iranians, and then the extension to Central Asia has stakeholders, the Central Asian stakeholders, and to an extent Russia as well. So it hasn't even gotten off the ground yet, and there are so many logistical issues that have to be dealt with in terms of just pure infrastructure, assuming everything else runs fine. So I want to get your thoughts in terms of then how can that sort of serve as an alternative or a counter, if I heard you correctly, I don't know if you made that argument, to the CPEC. Thanks.
All right, this one. Take another question. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Umar. I am in State Department Emerging Global Leadership Initiative Fellow from Pakistan, and I belong to the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the southern part and tribal area of Pakistan. My first question, I would ask Hussein in RF, how much Pakistan internally is unified on CPAC? And you think Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and federally administered tribal areas are the one which are mostly affected by militancy? And if you see the tribal belt, more than 10 million population, their education ratio for female is only 7.5. For male, it's only 22%. How the government of Pakistan doing for them? They are the ones which were the mostly affected. And if you see, government of Pakistan has started Orange Line Metro in Lahore, which is already in construction, and they are spending $1.6 billion on Orange Line. And what they did for the most affected areas of Pakistan, are we internally unified on this thing? are they doing something for those which are mostly affected? It will not create the head factor again? What are like the government Pakistan is doing for us?
Let me start.
Ex-
I can respond to that. Very valid points. 100% agree to you on that. Two things to this. First thing, you asked whether there is agreement or consensus on CPAC. There is 100% agreement and consensus on whether CPAC should be there or not. So every political party, everyone wants to get the maximum benefit out of it. The consensus where there is a problem is the logistical part. So CPAC, whether it should be there or not, it's already, there is a consensus on that. Now, we do have problems with, initially we had the problems with the route, specific projects, but to a lot of extent that has been cleared out. In Balochistan, for instance, we had the maximum number of projects right now under CPEC, 16. In KPK, we have 8 projects. In Punjab, I think we have only 9 projects. In Punjab, we have 12 projects, and in Sindh, we have around 13 projects, yeah. So CPEC do have the projects for the provinces. On the orange line, because it's a controversial issue, and I agree with you on that, there are problems. It's not just related to the CPAC. It goes back to the history of Pakistan, where we talk about the Balochistan, the development of Balochistan. They have serious issues. The worst, in my opinion, the development issue in Pakistan is actually the interior Sindh as well. It's as bad as the FATA region itself. So whether the government is doing anything or not, it is yet to be seen. Whether there is an interest, there is an interest. The Orange Line Metro comes under the tag of the cities as the engine of growth. You see, that is the provincial government taking ownership. A lot of these issues have been devolved. The infrastructure, the energy, the development itself, the education has been devolved to the provinces. So if you have one active chief minister of Punjab who is gung-ho about doing the development projects, it is seen by the other provinces as somehow taking their fair share, which is not the right thing, by the way. The FATA is a different ballgame altogether because they have genuine political grievances. They don't have a sort of representation. The reforms are badly needed. Whether the government is doing something or not, they have started the reform project, but I personally, in my scholarly opinion, I think the CPEC should not be equal. I agree with you. I would say that out blunt, it should be unequal in favor of the marginalized provinces. It has to be given. I mean, you cannot justify that just because you've given 16 projects to Balochistan or 2 projects to FATA, it is enough. We need to give them unequal share in favor of them. And that is where I think the difference will be. It will take time. I don't personally think that it is going to be done overnight. The reforms first have to be there in order to change anything on ground. But the comparison between the Orange Line and another thing, I think it's not fair because that has a completely different tone to it. It's provincial matter. And I'll also mention this out very clearly. 18th Amendment has been somewhat a big problem for Pakistan. As much as I support the devolution, it was done in haste. It was done in a way where the TORs, the logistical sides of it was not decided who's going to do what. What ended up happening was that nobody knew the provinces, that what they were doing on education part or what the central responsibility was. So we're still grappling with what exactly is the role post-18th Amendment of the federal and the provinces. And there has to be, the government and the provinces have to come to terms with that. So I think your points are completely valid and the government has to become more sensitive to the communities and to the marginalized communities in CPEC. And I initially mentioned this thing that is going to be the biggest challenge for Pakistan, whether you're able to maximize the benefit for the marginalized communities as well, which should be the focus.
Can I just quickly respond?
Yes, very quickly, though, so I want to make sure we get more time.
Just quickly, I mean, I think to some extent the sentiment that's expressed in terms of your statements reflects, I think, a confusion in Pakistan as to what exactly CPAC is. It's not a Marshall Plan. It's not a development project. It's primarily investment that is coming from China into Pakistan. So the economic viability of the projects are an important consideration. With that said, there have been at times in terms of the Orange Line, it's to some extent it's a slap in the face it's a slight to Pakistanis from smaller provinces because, the Orange Line project is economically viable. It has, a purpose in terms of urban development in Pakistan, but it has no linkage to regional connectivity or intercity connectivity. And at the same time, it probably will require around $100 million a year in terms of subsidies. So it's not necessarily, it's a sustainable project, but it's going to require huge subsidies from the state. So why could that have been done for, let's say, a project outside of Pakistan's core belt areas? But at the same time, you have a government that has kind of favored in terms of projects where its constituency is. So the PMLN is based in urban Punjab, and that's also where Pakistan's industrial centers are. So if you look at even the energy projects, the government has tried to list, there are X amount of projects in this province, Y in this amount, but the energy projects and in terms of the transmission are oriented around Punjab. So that energy will be, maybe it'll be developed in Sindh, but it will be transmitted up to Punjab. And there's an economic purpose for that, and there's a utility to it. But at the same time, there needs to be some compensation that's made to smaller regions of Pakistan.
Can I wait just a second? Okay, so what I want to do, because I know we're running out of time, is I want to see if there are more questions on the floor, and then if those can be done briefly, then we'll go back and give everybody probably about a minute to respond to the various questions and any final comments that you want to make. So well, if you could make your questions brief, then we'll probably have more time to answer them. So thank you in advance. Andrew, you can go first.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, I think maybe the first question, Hussein and Arif, both of you are pretty upbeat about this. And I guess if you just speak briefly to the issue of expectations management, because as you say, this is the poster child now. It's high expectations. Often in these contexts, expectations aren't met. So even if it's a positive benefit, it might not be as positive. We're already hearing it's generating, controversies as well as the positive benefits. That's the first one. The second one, just coming back to Mueed's point, which as a peace institute, I want to link it back to the peace issue. We haven't really touched on the issue of so much on the security side, where I think some of the assumptions, especially from the Chinese government side, is that the economic growth is going to be a key driver of stability in the region. And yet, a lot of the evidence shows, however, that that's not the case. More resources can be more resources to fight over, as we've just actually heard in the room. And so I think that assumption, is I would challenge. Whereas the key driver of conflict for me in Pakistan and South Asia writ large is the Indo-Pak one. And so again, coming back to this issue of how to use CPEC to, again, link more the East-West corridor, link it to that with the Indo-Pak piece, which I think economically makes a lot more sense. I think that's where you get the greatest peace dividends, which would contribute to stability in the region, including Afghanistan, out of which you then get your economic returns on your investment. But I think investing purely in Pakistan, which on one level is getting more and more internationally isolated as you build more and more roads and power plants. I think there's a bit of a contradiction there unless we can deal with the fundamental driver of conflict in South Asia, which is the Indo-Pak one. And if you can deal with that and get more economic growth in South Asia and get more than 1 billion people with more money and resources, I think that's the real win-win in the region, including for China in terms of markets for Chinese investment. So thanks.
And we had one more question in the back. Are you still, okay.
I'm in New York, I'll make it very quick.
Two quick questions. One, how do Western or other non-Chinese, non-Pakistani firms compete for work, either building the corridor or making investments alongside it? And number two, something that's been missing, we've heard every country in the area mentioned, but there's been no mention of really turning this over to the market and providing some type of, let's say, governmental incentives or competition and allowing the marketplace to determine where to build the routes and how to compete for business like we did in the U.S. back in the late 1800s. Thank you.
Great. One more question before we go? Yes.
Hi, my name is Jingwu from Institute for Global Engagement. This question is directed for Mr. Hai Zhao. So there have been attacks on Chinese workers in Pakistan as recent as last week. So I'm just wondering what's your take on what the Chinese government is going to address this challenge. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a number of questions on the table. We've got Chabahar as a counterweight, expectation management, more resources leading to stability, the Indo-Pak relationship, non-Chinese firms competing, market forces, and the attacks on Chinese workers. So everybody wants to take about a minute to respond to whatever resonates most with you and what you want to leave folks with before we close today. That would be terrific. So I think what we'll do is actually just go down the line. Sarah, we'll give you the last word. Hussein, do you want to start?
I'll answer the expectations part, I think, because that's where Pakistan and the US has been suffering a lot as well. On the expectations part, you see, the way the projects are being done, it has to be taken into understanding. The energy projects have been done under IPP mode. The infrastructure projects are being done in the EGC mode. Now, it is not the fact that the money is somehow going to come, it's going to get delayed. Under the IPP mode, under the EGC mode, the money is being given by the Chinese to their own contractors, to their own construction firms. So they're the ones who are developing it. The role of Pakistan is to provide the basic platform and the basic, I would say, support in terms of that. In the real economic terms, the expectations will be met. When you talk about the expectations, it will not be something like we have had a previous engagement with the US or with the World Bank, where half of the time people thought that the money was going into the politicians' pockets. With these projects, you can actually visibly feel the development. The road, the Karachi-Lahore motorway segment, the load shedding being reduced, you will actually be able to feel that. The second part on the expectation point is also this thing that starting from the project, this project became kind of controversial. So I feel that in Pakistan, the expectation is that this project is somewhere in the difficulties, it will happen, it will deliver, but there will be problems. The perception generally is that it is not taken as a project that will somehow be done very quickly or will start producing results right away. So I think the perceptions are there. The expectations, I think, on both sides are very clear because the conversation is going on a very higher level. And the deliverables are actually something that you can see visibly, and you can have you can already see the progress of the projects. And I think the expectations can be met on that. The India-Pakistan, I think the win-win situation. I personally am of the belief that for Pakistan, the biggest challenge is how are you going to make sure that this project can be done in a smooth and peaceful way, where you have India, which somehow has been very loud against the project for some reason. How do you bring India into this equation? I think that will be a big question. Into specifically the CPEC or developing another route with India, because I remember the Prime Minister, Shri, when he formed the 2013 government, his major focus was not China. His major focus was India. And that, I think, still is in the back of the heads. And I don't think the PM, Shri, will be interested in letting that go, because essentially the political party and the Prime Minister realizes the significance of working with India to bring about the peace dividend in the goal. And I agree with you that that is a central component, which despite the CPEC project, will, if it keeps on lingering, we will continue to have problems.
All right, 60 seconds. Ara.
Okay. I think I'll deal with that gentleman's question. In terms of, I don't think there's much space for non-Chinese companies to play a role in terms of CPEC projects directly. China's goal is to help export its oversupply, or overcapacity, and so it's essentially, to some extent, it's keeping its white elephants afloat through through these initiatives. There is one project in which it's a joint venture between a Chinese company and a Qatari investment fund. And so maybe perhaps a prerequisite is that let's say an American company partners with a Chinese company, but there are a lot of complications in terms of those sort of joint ventures, at least on this side of the Atlantic. In terms of the private sector, these are largely projects that are conceived and tendered by the government of Pakistan, especially in terms of infrastructure. So you don't really have, the direction is led by the government. There's private sector involvement, so many of the projects are build, operate, transfer and all that, and the energy projects are private projects in which electricity is sold to the national, to PEPCO, the Pakistan's national electricity company, the distribution company. And so, there are potential opportunities in that respect, but it's not. It's ultimately state-led, and there are partnerships with private enterprises if they want to come on board. Now, private sector companies could, for example, set up in these industrial zones that will be established throughout Pakistan. They can set up plants that leverage the energy connectivity, the logistics networks, and receive indirect gains from that. So I think that's where perhaps American companies, Western companies can benefit from CPEC.
All right, thank you. Hi.
I want to follow up. I think there's ways for American companies to participate, not just CPAC, but also Belt and Road Initiative. As far as I know, like GE and Caterpillar are all having a joint venture or some kind of investment in this. Chinese companies can be general contractors, but there are subcontracts to be made and money to be made in those projects. To answer the lady's questions about Chinese personnel security and also facilities security in Afghanistan, I think Chinese government mostly relied upon local government's protection and also Pakistan's military to secure the location and also personnel. There's a great debate right now in China. There's Chinese security firms pushing for reform and legislation to get licensed to go overseas for security purposes. But right now it's stuck. There's no further improvement on that front because not many foreign governments would allow Chinese security firms to carry weapons in those countries. So it's very difficult for them to acquire that kind of capacity. But still, Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs has improved its consular service for Chinese citizens. So if something happened, they will pull them out right away, no matter how much money they spend. So I think that's probably the only way they can do it for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Sarah.
Great having the last word. So briefly on Chabahar, I'm not going to get up here and tout for Chabahar. I think there are a lot of questions. But in India's defense, they were prevented from working on it for many years because of sanctions on Iran. Once the sanctions were lifted, India has moved fairly quickly, and they signed a deal in May. There is construction there. There is a port there. It's not starting from whole cloth. And they're working with a relatively high-capacity partner, which is Iran. So obviously everything has to start somewhere. It's not a riposte to Gwadar yet, but it could be down the road, especially if things quiet down in Afghanistan. The second thing I would say in terms of bringing India into the CPEC equation, I think the day that the Pakistani Prime Minister is the one in Pakistan setting India policy is the day that India will seriously consider joining CPAC. That's the last word. So.
All right, wonderful. Well, I wish we could stay for much longer because I think there's a lot more to talk about, but really appreciate everyone coming today. Thank you very much to our panelists for sharing your thoughts. I think this was a terrific discussion. Thanks to the audience for your great questions. And special thanks to Jennifer Chang and Rachel Vandenbrink for organizing all of this. Thanks again for coming, and we hope to see you at another event soon.
Thanks, Jennifer.
That was a lot.
Yeah.